Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Alice. Now, Alice is a 1988 Czechoslovakian surrealist fantasy film directed by Jan Švankmajer. I think I'm saying his name right, but I'm probably not. Now, prior to this, Švankmajer did a lot of animated short films, but this was his first feature, but he would go on to do a really interesting interpretation of the Faust legend, and that movie was freaking excellent. That's a movie I'm definitely planning on reviewing at some point. But Alice is based on the 1865 children's novel Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, better known as Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Now, of course, this story has had countless different adaptations of it. You had a few silent versions of Alice in Wonderland. Of course, you had the Walt Disney animated version from the 1950s. You had that Tim Burton thing from a few years ago. But of all the adaptations of this story, this might be the most interesting one, and it's certainly the most surreal adaptation of Alice in Wonderland that I've come across, which is saying something because it is meant to be a surreal story. Now, while the original novel was written for children, I can't necessarily say that this is a children's film. I mean, there's nothing in the film that's necessarily objectionable for kids, but I have a feeling a movie like this might actually freak some kids out, because there is some nightmarish imagery in this film. Like, it might freak little kids out, or it might be too weird for them, honestly. Some people have even labeled this as a horror film. Like, I actually got this VHS from a flea market that was selling a bunch of horror VHSs, and this was sold alongside them. Now, I'm not necessarily sure I would call this a horror film, but I've always maintained that genre can be a matter of opinion, and genre is not always a set-in-stone thing. Actually, I have a friend who does consider the original Lewis Carroll novel to be a horror story. His case for Alice in Wonderland being a horror story is that from Alice's point of view, it would be horrifying. Sure, there's a bunch of wondrous creatures that she's meeting, but at the end of the day, there's still an evil queen that wants to chop her head off. Now, Švankmajer has always interpreted Alice's Adventures in Wonderland as being a dream, as something that's not meant to make sense, as something that's not meant to have any sort of moral or even plot behind it. And while this is not necessarily a literal adaptation, he wanted to capture those feelings that he got from reading the novel with this film. Now, the plot of Alice is it's about this little girl named Alice who wakes up in this strange room and sees this taxidermied white rabbit come to life, and then she follows the rabbit into this strange and wondrous and surrealistic world. She encounters all these strange creatures, she finds these food items that cause her to shrink or grow, or turn into a doll. And then ultimately she runs into the Queen of Hearts, who has the white rabbit decapitate everybody who pisses her off. Now, Alice is a beautiful mix between live action and stop-motion animation. Now, even if you're not a fan of the Alice in Wonderland story, if you're a fan of art house cinema and surrealist cinema, then you should really give this movie a watch. And the film, just on a technical level, is breathtaking. Like, the stop-motion effects in this movie is so well done. And it's creepy, too. There's a scene where Alice opens up this can and cockroaches come out. In that same scene, you see a piece of meat moving around as if it were alive. When Alice shrinks, she basically turns into a doll. And a lot of the creatures that inhabit Wonderland are made from bones. The caterpillar from the story is this living sock with teeth and eyes. And you see all these living socks burrowing out of the floorboards in one scene. And I like how Wonderland in this movie is just this dilapidated old building that Alice is wandering around through. And while the film is based on a children's novel, it just has this real creepy tone and atmosphere, and it really does feel like this strange nightmare that this little girl is having. I also think it's interesting how Alice is the only speaking character in the movie. Whenever one of the characters that inhabit Wonderland speak, it's actually her saying what that character said. Almost as if this is all just some story she's reading to us.
Why is a raven like a writing desk? Said the Mad Hatter.
Now, even though the Queen of Hearts is technically the main antagonist of this story, if there's a true villain of this movie, it's that freaking White Rabbit. Because that rabbit is freaking vicious. Even though Alice is the one following him around, this rabbit wants her dead. Now, it's been a while since I've read the book. I don't remember the rabbit abusing Alice this much in the book. But again, I recommend Alice. I recommend it if you're a fan of surrealist cinema, or if you're a fan of art house films. I think this would definitely be up your alley. I can't necessarily recommend it for children, even though it's based on a story that was written for kids. I'm not sure. I feel like this would weird some kids out. But that was my review on Alice, and bye.